Mark Trellin thought he was tracking the missing hiker. Silas Dorn knew he was being watched. Asterisk 1 was a seasoned deputy searching for answers in the vast wilderness. The other, a ghost-like recluse with a trail of disappearances behind him. Their paths crossed in the heart of Rockland County's forest, where secrets are buried deep, and predators don't always walk on four legs. By the time Mark realized the truth, he was already standing on a killer's graveyard. And the killer was watching. In the heart of Rockland County, a place known more for its dense pine forests and quiet lakes than for any real danger, a missing persons case had just been closed without answers. Evelyn Marsh, a 29-year-old hiker from out of town, had vanished 6 months earlier while trekking along the remote Pine Hollow Trail. Her disappearance had sparked a brief frenzy. News, helicopters, rescue dogs, volunteers combing the woods, but it all fizzled into silence. After weeks of finding nothing. No backpack, no gear, not even footprints beyond a certain bend in the trail. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Deputy Mark Trellin couldn't let it go. He'd walked that trail a dozen times, retraced her route, interviewed store clerks, park rangers, even gas station attendants, hoping to hear something, anything that might explain how a grown woman could just disappear. But everything led to the same dead end. Evelyn had passed through town, bought trail mix and a bottle of water, waved at someone near the ranger station, then slipped into the woods and was never seen again. The official report said likely animal attack. Bears were rare in that region, but not impossible. Still, Mark wasn't buying it. He had worked in law enforcement for nearly 20 years, and something about this case gnawed at his gut. Not just Evelyn. 2 years earlier, a teenage boy had vanished while hiking a neighboring trail. Before that, a hunter's remains had been found scattered deep in the woods, his cause of death never fully determined. At the time, no one connected. The cases, people go missing in the wilderness. That's just the way of nature. But Mark kept seeing a pattern. It wasn't just the missing people, it was where they vanished. Always within a narrow stretch of forest, always alone, and always during daylight hours. Predators don't usually attack in broad daylight, and even the most remote trails had some sign left behind. But these people seemed to vanish mid-step. And now, with Evelyn's case filed and forgotten, Mark found himself driving the old patrol truck along the dirt road near Pine Hollow, alone, hoping for something to make sense. On that morning, the sun filtered through the trees in golden slivers, and the air smelled of damp pine and moss. Mark parked at the usual trailhead and walked a mile in, scanning the sides of the path. No wildlife, no distant hum of hikers or campers, just the quiet of untouched forest. Then he noticed something off to the left, barely visible under a tangle of brush, a narrow footpath that didn't appear on any ranger maps. The grass was slightly pressed, as if someone had recently passed through. It didn't look official or maintained. Something instinctual told him to follow it. He moved cautiously, pushing aside branches and ducking beneath low-hanging limbs. The trail curved, then dipped sharply downward toward a rocky stream. Across it, on a small rise, sat a structure, a weathered wooden cabin with a crooked porch and a small chimney puffing faint smoke. Mark stopped. It wasn't listed in any property database, and there were no permits for structures on protected parkland. Yet here it stood, nestled perfectly into the terrain, almost invisible unless someone knew where to look. He walked slowly toward it, hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon, not out of fear, but habit. As he reached the porch, a man stepped into view from the other side of the cabin. Tall, bearded, and dressed in patched flannel and boots, he looked like he belonged to the forest. The man raised a hand in greeting but said nothing. Mark nodded in return, introducing himself and asking casually about the property. The man said his name was Silas Dorn and that he lived off-grid, surviving off the land, wanting nothing to do with the outside world. He seemed harmless. Odd maybe, but not dangerous. Mark asked a few more questions, noted the coordinates on his GPS, then turned and left. He had no idea he had just shaken hands with someone who'd haunted that forest longer than anyone had guessed. No idea that Silas Dorn was the reason Evelyn Marsh and others had never come back. The forest didn't give up its secrets easily, and that suited Silas Dorn just fine. For years, he had lived in the wilderness beyond the boundaries of any marked trail, tucked far from the noise of town and the reach of law. His cabin, a crooked patchwork of old timber and rusted nails, sat half-hidden behind a curtain of trees and undergrowth. From above, it was invisible. From the trail, undetectable. Only those who veered far off course, or followed instinct instead of maps, would find it. And most didn't leave once they did. Deputy Mark Trellin returned to his truck. That day uneasy but unsure why. Silas hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't armed. He'd offered a simple story about solitude and survival. And yet, Mark's instincts didn't settle. Something about the man, the location, the complete absence of any sign of modern life, it didn't sit right. People living off-grid weren't unheard of in Rockland County, but they usually registered their homesteads, came into town occasionally for supplies, left some kind of digital footprint. Silas had nothing. No ID, no vehicle, no phone. Back at the sheriff's station, Mark filed a brief report on the encounter. Unregistered cabin spotted near Pine Hollow. Occupant named Silas Dorn. Appears non-threatening. Coordinates logged. The entry was buried beneath other daily logs and forgotten, except by Officer Janice Weller, who had always paid attention to the things others overlooked. She ran the name through the database, not expecting much. To her surprise, it pinged 8 years ago. Silas Dorn had been questioned in a missing persons case in Idaho. A young woman named Lila Bram had vanished while hiking alone. Silas had been living nearby at the time, working seasonal jobs, mostly off the books. He wasn't charged there. Was no evidence, just speculation. But the fact that he was even mentioned caught Janice's attention. She dug deeper. As she scrolled through old records, she found a strange pattern. Silas's name surfaced more than once, always on the edge of cases that went cold. He never stayed in one place long, just a few months in each location, always near wilderness or parkland. In Oregon, 2 hikers went missing in 2013. In Montana, a backpacker vanished in 2016. In every case, Silas had been nearby, living quietly, unnoticed. Until the disappearances drew attention, and he moved on. Janice brought her findings to Mark. He frowned as he scanned the documents. The coincidences were piling up, and that old feeling in his gut twisted tighter. He decided to go back out there. But this time he'd be more careful. He wouldn't confront Silas directly. He just wanted to observe, maybe catch a glimpse of something that didn't add up. That weekend, Mark hiked into the forest early, avoiding the main trails and staying low. He watched the cabin from a ridge above, noting Silas's movements. The man tended a small garden, chopped wood, and occasionally disappeared into the trees for hours at a time. No visitors. No communication. But something strange happened just before dusk. Silas emerged from the forest dragging a deer carcass, but its legs were bound with rope. Mark raised his binoculars, heart pounding. Wild deer didn't wear rope. That wasn't hunting. That was capture. Mark knew then that something was very wrong. He waited until Silas went inside, then circled the cabin from a distance. Near the back, partially covered in brush, he saw a narrow path leading into a shaded grove. There were marks on the ground, drag lines, as if something heavy had been pulled across the dirt. And there, half buried beneath a log, was a torn strip of fabric. It looked like nylon, maybe part of a hiking backpack. He didn't touch it. Instead, he took photos, logged the location, and slipped away before Silas could notice. That night, back at the station, Mark and Janice stared at the evidence and made a decision. They needed a warrant. They needed a team. Because whatever Silas Dorn was hiding in that cabin, it wasn't just vegetables and firewood. The days following Mark's discovery were filled with a quiet tension. He and Janice couldn't tell anyone else on the force, not yet. Sheriff Buck Holly was known for dismissing what he called paranoia fueled by wilderness myths, and he was just weeks away from retirement. He didn't want complications, but this wasn't paranoia. The rope-bound deer, the fabric scrap, the buried history tied to Silas Dorn, it all pointed to something darker than a reclusive hermit living off the land. Janice took the lead on building a timeline. Using data pulled from archived missing persons reports, wilderness ranger logs, and even old newspaper clippings, she mapped out 10 cases over the last 12 years that all shared uncanny similarities. The victims were always solo travelers or hikers, often young and physically fit. The locations varied: Idaho, Washington, Colorado, Montana, but always near remote wooded areas. And always with little to no evidence left behind. It was like the forest had conspired to swallow them whole. In almost every region, Silas Dorn had either worked odd jobs, stayed in temporary shelters, or been reported by locals as the man in the woods. No one paid attention because he was careful, moved often, and never left a mess behind. There were no police reports for violence, no known associates, no family members. He was a ghost who happened to live in plain sight, just out of reach. Mark reviewed the photos he had taken behind the cabin. The drag marks, the grove, the scrap of nylon, it all haunted him. He had walked out of that forest the first time completely unaware of the danger he'd been in. Silas had offered him dried meat, smiled as he spoke about surviving the winter, even pointed out animal tracks in the mud. That same man might have been killing people for years. The fact that Mark had stood so close to him, unarmed, trusting, sent a chill down his spine. They couldn't wait much longer. Janice contacted a friend working in state law enforcement and quietly submitted a background request, phrasing it as part of a cold case file. The response came quickly. Silas Dorn had no official records for the last 10 years, no taxes, no license renewals, no medical history. It was as if he had deliberately erased himself from the system. What Janice didn't expect, however, was a hit on a much older record, a psychiatric hold from 2007 in Denver, Colorado. Silas had been committed briefly after exhibiting violent behavior toward a former partner, who later filed a restraining order. That woman disappeared 3 months later. Her body was never found. With that piece, they had enough to request a formal investigation. But without solid proof, a warrant to search the cabin would be hard to get. Mark suggested another observation. Run, this time with hidden cameras. If they could catch Silas doing anything suspicious, it might be enough. It was risky, but there was no other option. Mark returned to the woods under the cover of early morning fog. He placed motion-activated cameras on the surrounding trees and carefully camouflaged them. As he crept around the perimeter of the cabin, he noticed something new. A shallow trench had been dug behind the garden, covered by a plank of wood and some dirt. It was too straight to be natural, too deliberate. He didn't touch it, just noted the coordinates and backed away. For 3 days they watched the camera feeds. At first, nothing unusual. Silas chopped wood, boiled water, tended to his garden. But then, on the 4th night, at 2:41 a.m., the camera caught something chilling. Silas dragging a large wrapped bundle through the trees. He stopped at the trench, removed the plank, and lowered the bundle inside. Then he filled the trench back up and vanished into the cabin without a word. Mark and Janice stared at the screen, heartbeats thudding. They had no more doubts. Silas Dorn wasn't just a recluse, he was a hunter. A predator hiding behind the quiet mask of isolation. And now they knew where he buried his prey. Deputy Mark Trellin couldn't sleep after watching the footage of Silas Dorn burying the bundle in the ground. He kept seeing the shape of it, the careful way Silas handled it, how practiced he seemed. It wasn't the act of someone panicking or covering up a mistake. It was routine, methodical. That trench wasn't the first. And it wouldn't be the last. By the next morning, Mark and Janice submitted everything they had: photos, maps, video evidence, the psychiatric record, and cross-state victim timelines. This time, they didn't ask for permission. They demanded it. Their district judge signed off on a limited search warrant for the property surrounding the cabin, specifically the area behind it where the burial had taken place. Sheriff Holly, reluctant but now cornered by the weight of the evidence, approved the operation. He insisted on a small team: quiet, no sirens, no media. Mark returned to the forest with 4 others. They approached at dawn, moving slowly through the trees. The cabin was still, no smoke from the chimney, no movement around the property. Mark motioned for the team to fan out and secure the perimeter before stepping cautiously onto the property. The trench site had been freshly covered. The dirt barely settled. They began to dig. 6 inches in, the shovel struck plastic. Carefully, they peeled away the soil, revealing a body wrapped in a blue tarp, bound with rope around the arms and ankles. The decomposition was advanced, but the clothing matched the description of a woman reported missing just 3 weeks earlier. From a nearby county, they stepped back in silence. No one had to say it out loud. It was real. Silas Dorn was a killer. Then something unexpected happened. One of the deputies at the tree line shouted for Mark to come quick. Down a slope behind the cabin, they had found something else: another trapdoor, hidden beneath a layer of pine needles and brush. It was wooden, reinforced with rusted hinges, and secured with a hook from the inside. After forcing it open, the air that spilled out was damp and foul. The team descended into darkness. Below the cabin was a narrow, dirt-walled basement with crude shelves, crates, and something worse: personal belongings, backpacks, hiking boots, torn clothing, ID cards. They found at least 7 different driver's licenses, all belonging to missing persons cases spanning over 10 years. A small journal rested on one of the shelves, its pages filled with bizarre entries, detailed sketches of faces, notes about trails, survival routines, and coded phrases no one could decipher. There were no screams, no outbursts, just a suffocating weight that settled over everyone inside that cramped underground space. They were standing in a tomb that had been active for over a decade, right under their noses. And Silas was gone. Mark raced back to the cabin, storming inside with his weapon drawn. The place was empty. The bed was made. The fire pit was cold. But there were signs of a quick departure: missing supplies, open drawers, an overturned chair. Silas had known they were coming. He'd slipped away, possibly hours before they arrived. A search of the immediate area turned up nothing. Dogs were brought in, but the terrain was difficult, and the trail went cold after a half-mile near a rocky stream. For days, helicopters scouted the forest, and deputies combed through brush and ravines. But Silas Dorn had vanished like mist in the morning. The discovery of the bodies and the evidence beneath the cabin made headlines across the state. Families who had lost loved ones were contacted, and for some, the nightmare finally ended with the confirmation of death. For others, there was still no closure, no identification, no resolution. Just the lingering question of how many more graves were hidden across the forest. And Mark couldn't escape one thought. Silas had watched him, fed him, walked the trail beside him, and still let him leave, as if it had been a test, as if he wasn't done yet. The manhunt for Silas Dorn stretched on for weeks. Helicopters swept through Rockland County's wilderness, while search dogs traced faint trails that led nowhere. Law enforcement from 3 neighboring states offered assistance, but the forest seemed to protect him. Every clue ended in silence. Deputies found abandoned campsites, boot prints in the mud, and empty food wrappers buried under brush, but no sign of Silas himself. It was as if he had become part of the wilderness, absorbed into its shadows. The state issued a formal warrant for his arrest and labeled him a serial killer. His face was on every news channel, every gas station bulletin board, every online feed. But Silas had spent more than a decade mastering the art of vanishing. He understood terrain, wind, scent, and silence. He knew how to erase footprints and move between blind spots. Searchers believed he had moved deeper into the highlands, where the woods became harsher and more unforgiving. Some even feared he might have taken his own life to avoid capture. But Deputy Mark Trellin didn't believe that. Mark had been haunted. Since the night of the discovery, he couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. He kept going over every detail in his head, the way Silas spoke, how he watched the trees when he talked, the way he offered food like it was a ritual. Mark had felt it then, but couldn't explain it. Silas wasn't just hiding in the forest. He was a part of it. The wilderness wasn't his refuge, it was his hunting ground, and he knew it better than any man they could send after him. Officer Janice Weller continued to sift through the journal they found under the cabin. The strange symbols and shorthand were slowly starting to make sense. Some of it referenced weather conditions, dates, and trail names. Other parts listed initials and strange phrases like Ridge Line 3 unworthy and 2 nights quiet. The journal wasn't a diary, it was a record, a hunting log. Names, movements, decisions. Janice realized Silas had been watching people long before he approached them. He studied their routines, calculated their isolation, and then struck. About a month after the search began, a trail runner reported seeing someone deep along the Spruce Ridge Trail, nearly 30 miles from Silas's last known location. The man claimed he saw a figure kneeling by a stream, cleaning something metallic. He didn't approach but noted the man's long beard and hollow expression. By the time a patrol team reached the area, there was no one there, only footprints leading into a steep ravine. Mark insisted on returning to the area himself. He hiked alone, carrying the weight of everything he'd seen. He didn't believe Silas had fled to disappear forever. He believed Silas was still watching, still waiting. Not for another victim, but for the right time to vanish completely, to slip beyond the edges of law and memory. Then, on a cold morning, deep in the forest, Mark found what he hadn't expected. Hidden under an outcropping of stone, buried beneath pine needles and moss, was another small structure. Not a cabin this time, but a camouflage shelter built into the earth. Inside were more belongings, cans, ropes, knives, and a map with marks spanning 3 states. Some circles were already crossed out. Others had names written beside them. One of the names was Evelyn Marsh. Another name was dated 2 weeks before her disappearance. The third was blank. Mark radioed it in. The shelter was photographed, the map taken into evidence, but there was still no sign of Silas. Only this. On the inside wall of the shelter, scrawled in charcoal, were 3 words, "You came close." That message haunted Mark more than any body or trail of bones. It meant Silas had been watching again, maybe from the trees, maybe from just beyond the rocks. He had seen Mark, had chosen to leave that message. A reminder that the hunter was never far. The case remained open. The bodies found were only a fraction of the whole story. Families still called the sheriff's department asking if they're loved. Ones were among the recovered. Some were, others weren't, and every few months another hiker would go missing. Some blamed the terrain. Others whispered about the man who disappeared into the trees, but Mark knew the truth. Silas Dorn wasn't gone, he was simply waiting.